Hey everybody, today I am reviewing maybe one of my most requested reviews ever, I think, on this channel, but I'm finally giving in to review Requiem for a Dream. This movie came out in the year 2000. It was written and directed by Darren Aronofsky. Requiem is a movie that was made really early on in his career. It's only his second feature-length film after the movie Pi, which received quite a bit of acclaim. Requiem is maybe one of his most remembered works and probably one of his most polarizing, which is saying something for him. It gave him that notoriety from audiences, and it was really remembered because at the time this movie was considered very graphic and very difficult to watch. Many people think that it's just as intense as it was then, and if you look at a lot of those lists of movies that you only want to watch once because they're too difficult to watch a second time, this one's usually at the top of those lists. And I mean, I guess I can understand that. This is a movie that is really devastating, and it is about addiction, essentially, whether it's through drug use as well as television addiction and food addiction, etc. It's very staccato, very bombastic filmmaking that enhances the downward spiral so that you are immersed in, I don't want to say the characters' mindsets because that would imply that there are actual distinct characters, but there really aren't here. So I'll just say it really immerses us into their feelings, their emotions, their paranoia, the desperation. The editing is by far the most interesting part of the film for me. So I'll start with that because that's my really big positive, and then I'll move on to the negatives because that's how I roll. This movie and the downward spiral aspect of it builds more musically than anything else. Aronofsky's using a lot of kind of hip-hop montage techniques, which surprisingly do not feel very dated at all. And the movie just overall is very kinetic, and it has that sort of swift pace that matches the feeling of dependency, especially when we're talking about uppers. Those quick cuts and those sound effects all contribute to the feeling of what that high really feels like. You know, it's one of those things where it feels really, really good in the moment, but the more that you depend on it, the more the high feels like it's not enough. So in the beginning, you see the quick cuts, but you'll notice they get quicker and quicker as the movie goes on. So I like the way that part of it was handled. As usual, Aronofsky is throwing every sort of editing technique that he can at you. Everything from, you know, like you've got your wide angle lenses, you've got split screens, you've got montages, and of course time lapses. I think that really takes a certain level of confidence, which Aronofsky definitely has. But I mean, it's a tough thing to pull off well. And I think it works, again, because the visual style so easily matches the instincts, the highs and lows of the characters. The time lapses, the wide angle lenses, and the split screens all add to that sense of feeling very disconnected, the characters feeling very disconnected from one another. And just the whole idea that this movie is about chaos. It's about isolating yourself through all of those fleeting desires and how dangerous that can be once you've reached the point of complete desperation. By the end, all of the connecting stories are interwoven in that final meltdown montage sequence, whatever you want to call it. And it is, I think, so effective and so horrific to so many people because, you know, all the characters they've lost total control. And now they are drowning. They are so immersed in the horror that they've been experiencing in each individual story that now they just all bleed together, and the individual stories don't even matter anymore. Ellen Burstyn is amazing in this movie. It has to be said. I think that she, of course, is a wonderful actress. We all know that she has been for years and years. You know, she's just a very elegant woman in real life, so different from the character that she plays. Sarah Goldfarb, who she's portraying here, is really the only resemblance of an actual character that we're seeing. And I think a lot of that is because her arc is more fully realized, and based on what they put her through, you really, really need a good actress. You can't have an amateur here. You need to have somebody who really has a handle on how to control their emotions and has that emotional maturity to pull something like this off. And it could not have been easy for her. I don't think anyone who's in an Aronofsky movie would ever say it was easy because he put you through hell. But she did it absolutely beautifully. She's brilliant because she just completely, every part of her body and her soul, she just embodies this kind of woman. And it's a woman that we all know, the aging woman who's alone and very kind of blindly dependent on false ideals to the point where it starts to snap her mind. She's very effective. Many of the techniques in this movie are very effective, which is why it's so remembered. But, and of course there's always a but with me, especially with Aronofsky. You all know, I've said this before, I'm not really a fan of Darren Aronofsky. I will give him this. I do think that he's an ambitious guy, and every time he has a new movie out, I feel like I need to see it. I am always intrigued, and when I do watch it, I typically always remember it. And I don't really care for many of his films at all, but it's kind of that whole thing about like looking at a dead corpse. It's like you don't want to look at it, but you can't help yourself. And I've said this about him a million times, I feel like, but you know, I'll say it again because I feel like it needs to be said in this particular instance with this particular film. But for me, his big problem is that he lacks depth. He lacks a lot of depth. He is mainly just viscera, especially here, and his characters are simply outlines of characters, and they're not actual fully realized personalities that can contribute to the themes of the story. Sarah Goldfarb is the only one that has any sort of thought put into her psychology, I think, and she could have used further exploration too, though. The rest of the characters are just, I mean, they're just outlines of characters, really, with kind of tacked on traits that give them something distinct so that you remember them, but that doesn't count to me as a fully realized character. They're just archetypes that are there to serve a purpose to further the story. They never feel tangible to me. You know, you've got the character like Jennifer Connelly's character who, you know, she's the artist girlfriend of Jared Leto. Then you've got Marlon Wayans, who's the dealer with the mother issues. But this is all we really have to go by. And this is, of course, just my own personal opinion. But I think that if we had more to work with in terms of motivation, we could really dig into the psychology behind the addictions that these characters have and how they are similar to each other, how they're different, and why it tears them apart. I think Aronofsky he frustrates me more than anything else because I think he's perfectly capable of really pushing further and really going out of his comfort zone. He's definitely not as deep as he thinks he is, but I think that he's not as shocking as he thinks he is either. When you watch this movie and you think about it afterwards, what are you taking away from it, really? Just the idea that addiction and dependency is bad and that the culture can be kind of toxic and it isolates us. And it's like, okay, you know, we know that, and that's been handled many times before and better than in this film, I think. And that's the thing, is like the question is why? You know, I don't get enough of the why in this film or many of Aronofsky films. And I think that that's his problem, is what I said before. He's more shocking than he thinks he is. I think he hides behind his shock value so that he doesn't have to go for more of that exploration here. And I think that the editing, while it is extremely impressive, it only distracts from the idea that there's nothing to really grasp underneath it. I saw in an interview back when the movie was coming out, and he was talking about how he gets really annoyed with style over substance, and I feel like he's a victim of his own criticism. Another thing that has always kind of bothered me is his use of surrealism, because he's used that a lot. And, you know, even like in movies like Black Swan and Mother, you do see a lot of that in particular, a lot more than you do in this film. But yeah, he's using a lot of the surrealism and the dreamlike imagery and things. And I'm fascinated by dreams and what they represent, especially when you're combining them with the medium of film. And I feel like with dreams, there are so many ways that you could explore the subconscious aspects of these characters. But Aronofsky is very literal, and all of the surrealism here is very literal. It's expected, and it lacks imagination. There's a moment where Jared Leto's character looks out the window and he sees his girlfriend, and it's like, you know, it's Coney Island, and she's standing on a dock. And that just, I don't know, that's just it's not an interesting symbol at all. It's very obvious. There's no layers to peel back. It represents the ideal, the dream that you can't grasp. Sarah Goldfarb, again, has the more interesting exploration, I guess, just because we see her full downward spiral because she became addicted to the diet pills over the course of the film, whereas the other characters already were struggling with their addictions. You know, there is a part, of course, where she really starts hallucinating a lot, and there are a lot of ways you could play with that part of your subconscious and those desires and how they're tied to her past and her motivations. Here she's fantasizing, of course, about food because she's hungry, and her refrigerator comes to life in the apartment, and yeah, it's all very surface level. There is one part though where, you know, she's watching TV, she's addicted to the TV, and all of a sudden the people on the TV come to life, and they're in her actual apartment surrounding her, and it's meant to be kind of a very horrific sort of moment because it's meant to be like, yeah, a nightmare for her. And there's one moment where the television host comes in and he starts making out with the television version of Sarah Goldfarb, and she's watching. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's cool, because, you know, that's maybe exploring a little bit more of the Freudian territory, the Freudian implications there. And I was like, okay, let's push that but they don't. And people may not agree with me on that. I just feel like there's so many directions you could open that up in and make it more complex. And there are a lot of artists out there that do that, past as well as present. You've got people like Luis Buñuel, if you want to watch, some of the older surrealism. That's absolutely some of the best you'll ever see. Or you could watch a film by David Lynch, or even one of the long dream sequences in a television show like The Sopranos. There's so much to ponder in all of those. And as this movie stands, even though I think that Aronofsky thinks that he's really unsettling you, there's nothing much in the imagery that pushes me to a place that I haven't been before. In more recent Darren Aronofsky movies like Black Swan or Mother, which came out last year, his most recent movie, I've noticed that he's starting to veer more into a comedic approach, because both of those movies are hilarious, and I will argue anybody who disagrees with me on that. But I think that there are even humorous moments, touches of humor in Requiem for a Dream for sure. I don't know if they're intentional or not, but they are. Of course, I try to keep in mind always that this was only his second feature-length film, and he still had a lot to learn about, I think, reining himself in and creating that cohesion. But I never felt like he really matured much. If you look at him over the course of his career, he's kind of remained mostly on the same level. I know that a lot of audiences, especially at the time and still are today, as I said, were strongly affected by this film. And I get it. I understand why. The subject matter and all of that's handled is meant to be really devastating. Aronofsky wants to really fuck you up. He wants to shake you up and kind of scar you. But I think that you've got to ask yourself, what are you gaining from it beyond the jarring aspects of it? I keep returning to that. I think it's worth watching, actually, purely from an editing standpoint, just because I think that the aesthetic of this film is just really interesting. And I would argue that it's one of Aronofsky's more interesting pieces aesthetically. Just don't expect this movie to hold up on multiple viewings. When I first saw this movie, I was probably about 16, and it did affect me emotionally, of course, at that time. Then I saw it a couple years later, and I just kind of was like, oh, that wasn't as good as I remember. And watching it this last time, it felt very similarly to that. If I somehow was able to talk to Darren Aronofsky and give him advice, like he would ever listen to me, but still, hypothetically, if I could, I would say explore the humor in your films, explore the humor in your point of view, and explore the concepts more. Get out of your comfort zone. I think that's just like the most important thing I can stress there. And that's my review. Thank you all for listening. All my social media information is below. You can watch more videos here, and you can subscribe if you'd like. Catch you next time.